Welcome back to Close Read. This episode is focused on persuasion. Persuasion is a fun topic to think about because I feel like a lot of the mainstream media narratives around persuasion don't really grapple with what persuasion looks like to political communication professionals and how we think about our audience and how we think about persuading our audience to do things or to think differently about things. So to start off with the basic image that people have of persuasion and how we discuss persuasion in the press, it's usually based around Enlightenment values, little L liberalism, visions of what it means to persuade somebody. So this is like Yascha Monk's work around persuasion and the value of persuasion that he's talked about in The Atlantic and with a new website that he's launched. He was also one of the guys who was promoting the Harper's letter about open debate. And this is the sort of marketplace of ideas. We're gonna hash things out and debate things, and we're gonna persuade each other of the good and right positions. And that happens for some people. You can have a salon with some other intellectuals and writers, and you can have a discussion and persuade each other. That's fine and good, right? You can do that, but it's for a rarefied audience. It's for an audience of folks who are pretty engaged, who are able to have these discussions with one another, and it's a little bit of a clubhouse, right? I want other people who think about persuasion like this to come and have persuasive, debatey conversations with me in my clubhouse. And that's cool. Don't want to knock anybody's clubhouse. But outside the clubhouse, we have this really contentious world of political communication where people are fighting for attention. They're fighting for resources. They're fighting over how issues are framed. They're trying to push the Overton window toward their side of the debate. So people do what they want when it comes to implementing their policies. So in political communication world, it's a lot more nuanced. It's a lot more contentious. And the bulk of this episode is a conversation with Anat Shenker-Osorio. She is just a genius political communication researcher and practitioner. She's the founder and principal of ASO Communications. I first learned about her work through the race-class narrative. And I'll talk about that a little bit, but it's really detailed political communication research into how progressives can talk about race and class in ways that are mobilizing for their base and also persuasive to the persuadable voters in the middle. So often when we're talking about persuasion, we're actually having a tacit argument about who is worth persuading. And I should say at the outset that a lot of think tanks, a lot of NGOs, a lot of organizations with millions and billions of dollars behind them to advocate for issues, especially in DC, organizations that have money to hire consultants and full-time staffers to go pitch journalists, they're built to persuade policymakers to find bipartisan compromises on a given set of issues. And that happens with organizations that people usually point to in this field that are, say, focused on the budget deficit, and they're going to get some blue dog Democrats and they're going to get some Republicans together, and we're going to solve the budget deficit. And they get really into budget deficit stuff and scaremongering around the deficit. But it also happens on what we sometimes think of as the progressive side of issues, right? There's a big effort, which we've discussed in the podcast before, 2009, 2010, to get a bipartisan compromise on climate policy at the national level. And that was a lot of NGOs, a lot of think tanks, a lot of advocacy groups and green groups that are very progressive, trying to grab a couple Republican votes to make something happen on Capitol Hill to get a cap-and-trade system implemented, and that failed. The Republican Party was not down with that. They did not want to give that victory to Barack Obama. But that's all to say who we're built to persuade. That it changes our messages. It changes who we're going to go after in the press. It changes a lot of things strategically, and it privileges some perspectives over others. So if you're investing $1 million in an NGO that's looking for a bipartisan compromise on something, that's $1 million that you're not spending persuading, say, young Latina women to become first-time voters, right? So you're creating different coalitions. You're creating a different politics by who you want to spend time persuading and to what end, right? These are active political choices. There is not a free and open level marketplace of ideas. There is no agora where people come and meet to debate these things out and say, good point. I am persuaded. Thank you, Socrates, for explaining that to me. The other thing that we need to keep in mind when we talk about persuasion is that persuasion doesn't work by like shifting somebody to a new position right away. That can happen. It's pretty magic if you can make that happen. But you're not necessarily convincing somebody to go from A to B, right? You're convincing somebody who latently has some opinions, a little bit of A, a little bit of B, to maybe care more about A. And to think more about A and to politicize on A and think of A as the position that they find persuasive. And, to do that, you have to get a message in front of somebody. So anytime you share a political message with somebody, they're more likely to accept that message. And we call that the exposure effect. You call it the familiarity effect. And what that means in sort of raw power terms is that a good message that someone sees 1,000 times is probably going to perform better than a great message that someone only sees once. Okay? And this is just like such a basic fact when you put it this way, but really think about like every op-ed column you've ever read about like, Democrats should do this message or that message, or climate advocates should do this message or that message, or I don't think defund the police is a good message. I think a better message is about reform. And it's like, well, okay, maybe, in a lab in a petri dish, but like, what's your plan to get your good preferred message in front of people 1,000 times? Because the people who are against your policy, they have a message that, you're a wacky leftist who's going to sink the entire country, or you want to take away people's cows and cars, or you're gonna make home heating much more expensive for grandmas out there, right? They're going to try to get that negative message in front of people 1,000 times. So it is a competitive environment. And if you have $1 billion to spend on your political message, exposing people to that message over and over again, that's an easy problem for you to solve. You can throw money at it. But if you're part of a progressive movement organization, if you're a volunteer, if you're an activist, if you're somebody who's, trying to do some good in the world over here, and you're not sitting on $1 billion, you need to rely on your own base to carry your message for you, right? You can't just blanket the airwaves with your message. You need something that makes sense to other people, that's going to be inspiring for them, that is going to get people to carry that message to other people. That's how you propagate your message. The other thing to keep in mind here is that persuasion happens in degrees, right? So it's not black and white. We often have this discussion around persuasive messages. Okay, well, defund the police is terrible. It's going to have all these backfire effects. You got to talk about reform instead. And a more broad-minded view is to say, actually, both of those messages can be effective with the same audience. They can be effective with different audiences in different ways. It's actually a lot grayer, right? And they can be effective for different purposes, right? Defund the police is going to be a great message for actually reducing police budgets, if that's your policy goal. Reform the police is going to be a great message for maybe increasing their budgets, ironically, to pay for more training or to pay for more body cameras or you name it. So there actually is, an ideological and policy division baked into that messaging. So to say, well, message B is more effective than message A, gosh, that could have a lot of assumptions baked into it around who you're talking to and what your goals are. But even more prosaically, you can think of messaging as having persuasive effects in degrees, right? So I'll use climate change as an example again. If I march into a community meeting and I say, climate change, it's a dangerous threat to our public health. Look at these extreme temperatures. This is bad news. This is going to make our air unhealthy to breathe. You're going to have heat strokes more often in the summer. Bad news. Environmental health, threat. So that could be a really effective message. I bet you people who come out of that meeting would have a higher rating if you asked them to rate their risk to climate change. Would they be more supportive of climate policy? Yeah, sure. But what if I combine that message with a discussion of local climate solutions? What if I go in there and say, and that's why we need more trees in our city. We need more shade to reduce the urban heat island effect. We need to invest more in clean energy. We need to invest more in electric car infrastructure so we have less pollution going into the air and less ground level ozone when people are just trying to breathe on a hot day. That might be more persuasive because now I've got people engaged on solutions too. And this is sort of obvious, but it's worth bearing in mind. The first message is persuasive. The second message, the combined message, is also persuasive, right? it's more persuasive, and it's persuasive in a different direction. Now, I'm some guy from DC in a suit and a tie. Maybe I'm not the most credible messenger at this city council meeting, but maybe if a council member stands up or a community leader from a group you like stands up and says the same thing, well, that's even more persuasive, right? So again, persuasion is on a spectrum here, right? We have more persuasive and less persuasive messages. We also have messages that are straight up bad, that have backfire effects. We're pretty good at avoiding those, right? Usually if a message has really bad backfire effects, your audience tells you pretty quickly. You notice that over time. Smart communicators avoid those messages. So it's usually we're having a debate about what's the most effective message in a given political context. And Anat and I are going to talk about the race-class narrative, and I'll link to this in the show notes too. If you haven't had a chance to look at some of the race-class narrative materials, they are excellent, and they take this really contentious set of issues that are contentious in and of themselves, and also contentious in how we talk about them and how we talk about them. And it is a great example of political communication research that tries multiple approaches and finds that some are more effective than others. There's not a wrong approach, but there is a best approach given the framework that they use here. So I'll just give you a short example of two messages that they tested, message A and message B. So message A, to make life better for working people, we need to invest in education, create better paying jobs, and make healthcare more affordable for people struggling to make ends meet. This is pretty boilerplate, bread and butter, like liberal progressive stuff, right? Okay. Now let's check out message B. To make life better for working people, we need to invest in education, create better paying jobs, and make healthcare more affordable for white, black, and brown people struggling to make ends meet. So it introduces people's race into the message. It performs better. It performs better with the base. It performs better with persuadable voters. They both do well. They're both persuasive messages, but message B, which combines race and class, is more persuasive than message A. And a lot of what they found in this research, too, is that addressing race and class together is necessary because they tested it against conservative messages that try to demonize people based on their race, that try to demonize people based on their immigration status. And you need a counter. Otherwise, you are ceding that territory to your opponent. So in this initial research, the winningest message, the bestest message among all the messages went like this. No matter where you come from or what our color, most of us work hard for our families. But today, certain politicians and their greedy lobbyists hurt everyone by handing kickbacks to the rich, defunding our schools, and threatening our seniors with cuts to Medicare and Social Security. Then they turn around and point the finger for our hard times at poor families, black people, and new immigrants. We need to join together with people from all walks of life to fight for our future, just like we've won better wages, safer workplaces, and civil rights in our past. By joining together, we can elect new leaders who work for all of us, not just the wealthy few. And if that sounds like progressive-y rah-rah to you, great, good. I think that Democrats and folks on the progressive side of things, they're moving toward messaging like this because it's effective and because it's also true, right? This is the framework for actually winning progressive policy fights. But even politicians, members of Congress, whatever, who lean way more into class, right? And this is a criticism that we saw of Sanders. He leans a lot more into class and has an older way of talking about a lot of these issues. That's still effective. The race-class narrative is just more effective. And I'll point to some more of those resources. These are active choices political actors, advocates are making all the time. Race-class narrative is just really first-in-class, good, solid political communication research. And if you work on issues where you don't have research like that, get some research like that. Do some research like that. It's really foundational to figure out which messages are working with which parts of our audiences and which messages are actually deeply resonant with our base and help carry them through to folks in the middle. So to kick off this conversation, I wanted to talk about something else that I think was illustrative that we've had a lot of online conversations about, and that's been ads from the Lincoln Project. And you're probably familiar with the Lincoln Project. They've had some very popular ads. They are comprised of anti-Trump Republicans. Last quarter, they raised about $16.8 million, and their mission is to defeat Trump, as well as several Republican Senate candidates who have enabled Trump and his agenda. So for scale, Joe Biden's joint fundraising committees, they brought in about $100 million last quarter. So, Lincoln Project, it's serious money. It's not at the level of like a huge presidential campaign, but, they're a player. And the other thing about them that I think is interesting, that makes them an interesting jumping off point for a conversation about persuasion, is that their ads do really well with liberals. And that gives liberals and progressives a little bit of pause, because it's like, okay, this organization is using these ads to take Republican voters and turn them against Trump. They want to persuade them to vote for Joe Biden. But they're using arguments that liberals think should be very effective with conservatives. So liberals are getting them to go viral on Twitter and on Facebook, and they do a lot of really, really great job engaging people on those social media platforms. So that has produced sort of a split response for how people think about this organization and its ads. On the one hand, you have some liberal operatives who are like, this is the stuff that I've wanted to do with Democratic campaigns for years. I've really wanted to go after Republicans and just wreck them with stuff like this, and I love how they troll Trump and they get Trump to respond to them and they get tons of media coverage. This is an aggressive ad campaign. I love it. And then you get another class of response, which is to say, I'm deeply suspicious that these ads actually work because they're too persuasive to liberals. They're too close to what a liberal thinks a conservative should find persuasive. I don't think conservatives are actually finding many of these ads persuasive. I'm deeply skeptical. And I should say, too, we don't have their data. Right. They have their data, and they actually have two different classes of ads, which we discussed a little bit offline. So I'm going to play an ad called Distracted, which is the type of ad that has gotten shared a lot by liberals, even though the ad is supposedly targeting conservatives who are going to switch over. And that's a kickoff to our conversation. But if you want to check out all their ads, I'm going to link to them also in the show notes. So they have some ads that are a bit more in line with Republicans sharing stories about why they're moving away from Trump. And maybe those are more persuasive. We don't know. At some point, maybe after the election is over, they'll publicly share the data and we can settle this stuff. But I think it's fun to think about now, and it's a jumping off point for a really deep, nuanced conversation with Anat about persuasion and how persuasion actually works from the perspective of a practitioner who helps people and campaigns and advocacy groups figure this stuff out live in a highly competitive, uncertain environment. So with that, here is Distracted by the Lincoln Project.
Coronavirus has now killed 3 times more Americans than 9/11. So what's Donald Trump been up to? Blaming the impeachment hearings for distracting him from preparing for the pandemic.
I think it took a lot of, I see them going and saying about speed. Well, I got impeached.
In January, Trump's own senior advisor issued a memo warning him that coronavirus presented a grave threat to the United States. Days later, the World Health Organization declared it a global health emergency. Where was Trump? He wasn't distracted. He had plenty to do, like campaign rallies and golfing. In February, the virus spread to Europe. While Italy was shutting down and quarantines were being announced all over the world, Trump played more golf and packed thousands of people together. Sounds safe. The day before the first American died, where was Trump? Where do you think he was? At another rally. By March, the world was calling coronavirus a pandemic. Where was Trump? On Twitter, as usual, blaming everyone else. When Trump finally bothered to take it seriously, it was too late for 10,000 Americans, and who knows how many more. Trump just didn't care. He still doesn't. He was never distracted, and Americans have been paying attention.
So we just heard the ad Distracted from the Lincoln Project, and I wanted to bring you onto the podcast because we've been having this rolling discussion about whether or not these ads are actually persuasive to voters who might be persuaded to not vote for Trump this year. And you noted that some of these ads, liberals like them a lot, so maybe we don't know how persuasive they are with independents or conservatives, but they might have backfire effects too. And you flagged this one as one that might have some of those potential backfire effects. Could you talk about that a bit?
Yeah. So looking very specifically at the task of persuading soft Trump supporters, and I want to be clear, That's not necessarily my theory of change. That's not necessarily the way that I operate politically in the world. I actually believe that our job is to engage the base in order to persuade the middle. But when we're just looking at the task of speaking to soft Trump supporters, we actually have a huge body of data around who these folks are, what is persuasive to them, what causes backlash. And the first thing that we know about them, and this is just intuitive common sense, so I don't think this is a shock, but when you're looking at what is the low-hanging fruit inside of that category among people who voted for Trump in 2016 and still have some measure of attachment to the guy, they haven't written him off entirely yet. So wrap your brain for a moment around that kind of human being. Try to imagine that there's a person who has not written him off yet. That's who you're trying to talk to. The softer targets, the people who are more gettable, if you had to guess, Aaron, would you guess that women are softer supporters or men?
Oh, that's tough, because I would guess that women are
It's
more
women.
persuadable. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's women. Would you guess that it's younger Trump supporters or older?
I would assume younger ones because
younger.
they're just not as locked in yet, right?
Yeah, it's everything that you would guess. It's not a trick question. So the lower hanging fruit is women, it's younger, it's less religious, it's more educated, etc. Everything that is just common sense. So if your strategy were to be, I want to persuade soft Trump supporters, I want to be a conservative voice, a trusted messenger that is reaching into this group, then that is who you would go for. So the first issue with a lot of the Lincoln Project ads, including the one that you shared, is that it is not targeted at women. It's not targeted at younger people. It's targeted at older people, and it's targeted at men. And that's especially acute in some of their other ads that really rely upon militaristic tropes and military leaders. The second thing that's notable about that ad and sort of the general structure of their ads, and is just that they're like the length of a Ken Burns documentary. And so it's a little bit astounding that any kind of political communication professional who makes ads and knows, and this is just a standard metric, that the vast, vast majority of people stop watching an ad that is expressly political in the first 4 seconds. You've basically lost 80% of your audience in the first 4 seconds. So one of the things that we know about persuasive ads, and this actually extends beyond soft Trump supporters, this is broadly true of anyone outside of the category of political junkie, is that they don't like politics. They don't like talking about politics. They find it distasteful. They'd rather change the channel. They'd rather not have that conversation. And so ads that are persuasive across audiences, including soft Trump supporters, and ads that are effective at mobilization are the ones that don't look political. They're the ones that bring down your walls and your defenses, either by using humor or using surprise, so that you don't know that you're about to watch a political ad. Instead, ads that kind of wear their politics on their sleeve, which is the vast majority of them, they're the equivalent of when you're going to sit down with your romantic partner and they say to you, "We have to talk." As soon as somebody says we have to talk, how do you feel? You're already like, I don't.
Yeah. All your defenses are up. Your nervous system's firing. You're if it's real bad, you're just going to fight or flight mode. But of course, you can't change the channel, or click off.
So basically, what an ad does when it telegraphs its political nature from the first second is it tells the viewer, I'm about to talk to you about politics, which they don't like, makes them unhappy, and forces them into their prefrontal cortex, into the do I agree, do I disagree, the argumentative, the combative, as opposed to keeping them in their amygdala, their feelings, opening them up to the idea that you're going to present to them, which is what happens. I mean, let me put it differently. So, you know how there a lot of commercial sector ads, if you had to guess what the hell the ad was about, you couldn't until the very last moment, right? Like a father and son are fishing on lake whatever and talking about deep thoughts, and then it's an ad for a car. Yep. Or a bunch of people are running through a meadow enjoying life and it's an ad for a restaurant. That's intentional. It's because Madison Avenue knows that if you put people's defenses up, if you signal to them, I'm going to try to sell you this thing, then they are already resistant to the message that you're giving them. The next thing about the ad, and this is where I will stop, I will get off my soapbox, is that one of the hallmarks, one of the most important things that we need to do in terms of persuasion of soft Trump supporters, which I need to underscore, is not my theory of change, but is what I'm responding to in this ad, and whether or not it does that task, is you need to do something we call open up the permission architecture for the person to reckon with having been wrong. Yep. So if you're trying to talk to somebody who voted for Trump in 2016, who again still maintains some measure of attachment to the person, and your ad is essentially, a Ken Burns documentary length diatribe about how everything about this dude is awful, which works for me. That works for me. But then again, I'm a never Trumper. And so are you, Aaron. And so are the people who made this ad. These ads work. They're made by never Trumpers for never Trumpers, which is why the left loves them. If instead you're a person who voted for Trump, then what happens, we see in measurement, is that there's actually a backlash effect where it can feel like if they're attacking this person, they're actually kind of attacking you. They're actually kind of saying you were a fool, or you were an idiot, or you were bigoted, or you were a bad person. And it's a natural human instinct to feel defensive when you feel attacked. And so ads that persuade soft Trump supporters have to ideally not look like political ads, use humor, use surprise, and or offer an out. Say, I hear ya. I voted for the guy too. In 2016, I thought he was the change that we needed. And I hope it's clear to everybody listening, like, these aren't my personal feelings. I'm just narrating kind of what happened, what needs to happen, so that the person listening feels like, oh, I'm not going to be judged.
Yeah, we've talked about this a little bit in terms of like what's your excuse to take a position that is against type, and that even happens with policymakers. One of my favorite examples was Senator John Warner from Virginia, who's retired now. He's a Republican who supported climate policy, and that was against type for him. But the way that he would explain that, particularly to other Republicans, was my grandkids sat me down and they gave me a lesson on climate change, and they said this was the real deal, and I had to deal with it. And I love the term permission architecture too. But for somebody like him, it's such a powerful excuse because you can't argue with it. It's his grandkids, right? And to your point, it's a deeply personal way to approach it. You're not gonna fight that with spreadsheets and facts. It's his personal relationship that he can speak to.
The other thing about that, and there's emerging research from Craig Fox in particular about this, is what you've described is also pinpointing a justification. Mm-hmm. So some measure of it, I guess the cynical explanation, is that there's some need to save face. And, that sounds cynical, but there's a basic human instinct of self-preservation, and that preservation extends not just to your corporeal being, it also extends to the way that you face the world and how people view you, and whether you're viewed as consistent or inconsistent, coherent or incoherent. And motivated cognition is a hell of a drug. It's exceptional how strong it is. And by motivated cognition, for folks unfamiliar with that phrase, the ability that we have as human beings to self-justify an idea or position that we have it's astounding what people can do and perform in order to make sense of or explain why it's perfectly logical and in fact desirable that they hold some position. And so one of the things you would need to do if the task you believe is before you, is to persuade people who had a position, who had a view, who had a feeling, and who still maintain it, to have a different one, is you need to provide them an explanatory story for why they changed their mind that allows them to maintain their sense of integrity and their sense of themselves as a person who believes things, who knows things, who is smart, who is principled, etc.
So I wanted to back up a second, because when we talk about persuasion more broadly in the media, I feel like there's this sort of Enlightenment, Socrates and Aristotle hashing something out in the agora vision of persuasion, right? And for operatives like us, for people who do this sort of work day to day, I think we have different operating definitions of what persuasion is. So I'd be curious to get your take. Like, how do you define persuasion? When I say persuasion, what does that mean to you in your professional life?
Yeah, it means several different things. It depends on exactly what the dependent variable is, right? What it is we're trying to get people to believe or do or want or think. I often like to tell people that the job of a good message is not to say what is popular, it's to make popular what we need said. And so the fixed point is, what do I need people to think? What do I need people to feel? And what do I need people to do? And then you're measuring the efficacy of a message, its ability to persuade, on that basis. You are not measuring the message in terms of, do people agree with it? Do they find it credible? Do they like it? The message isn't running for homecoming queen. There's some degree of correlation between people rating a message as that they're amenable to the message and that it actually causes them to alter what they believe and want to do, but it's not a one-to-one. So first of all, we have to measure persuasion in a particular context, right? So a message that is persuasive for GOTV is a message that gets people to actually go register, or gets them to vote by mail, or gets them to actually complete the process of voting. A message that is persuasive on vote choice, that moves people off of Trump, moves them toward Biden, and we can go on and on and on. So that's what it is we need to be measuring. It also, a persuasive message is also one that recognizes that politics is not solitaire. And we do not exist in a world in which we get to make our opposition shut up. If we did, I think we would all be a lot less stressed out, and our life would be a lot easier, and we would, be drinking.
Yeah, that's like it's easy mode, right, on the video game of politics. That does not exist. There's no easy mode.
Yeah, there's no easy mode. So because people do not hear what we say to them in a vacuum, they hear what we say to them in the context of the stories they've been told their whole lives, what they saw on television last night, what the opposition mailer and ad said, what the race baiting and place baiting was from the other side. We need to understand not merely how our messages are landing for people, but also how they are acting as a rebuttal to what the other side is saying. Because otherwise, so for example, to take a really pointed example, there has been a long and unforgivable trajectory among Democrats to think that it is somehow anathema to talk about race. And this is changing, but it's still largely true. There's still a lot of discomfort around it. There's still this kind of lingering feeling that we need to not talk about quote unquote identity politics, which of course in a functional country, we would call human rights, but not this one. That we just need to talk about, quote, bread and butter issues. We need to talk about wages and working conditions. Well, that theory would be all well and good. It's not all well and good. It's completely and totally wrong. But the other side is talking about race left, right, and center all day long. And so if the left chooses to make colorblind arguments that are just about economic issues, they go for the targeted universalist kind of approach, then it's not like the conversation about race ends. The other side is going to continue to be dog whistling. And that means that all you're hearing about immigrants is that, there are these magical people who are both not working and taking your job. All that you're hearing about Black folks is that, they're committing crimes, or they're not doing the right thing, or they're, to give you a throwback dog whistle, quote unquote, welfare queens. Our choice to remain silent about race as the left is not a choice to end the conversation about race. It's a choice to allow that entire conversation to be dominated by the lies and dog whistles of the right.
So I wonder if you could dive a little bit deeper into that, because I do think the race class narrative work is incredible, and I'll link to it here. And I've found it super useful in my own work. But I was curious to ask you how you actually do the testing to see what's persuasive with a given audience. And I know that there were a lot of rich examples in the race class narrative work too. And I mean like the mechanics of it, like how you actually expose people to messages, rate them before and afterward. I think it's beneficial for folks to understand how we actually test and measure these things.
Yeah. So we do it in lots of different ways, but basically the through line is we rate the messages. So we break people up. We look at the sample and we break people up based on their ideological proclivities. We do not break people up just in terms of their partisan identity. And what I mean by that is if you have a representative sample, I'll just make up a number of 5,000 US voters, then what you want to do is you want to ask them a whole bunch of questions around policy and ideology that tells you which of the folks in this sample agree with us on racial and economic justice. So those questions could be things like, to what extent do you agree, disagree? Immigrants contribute to our culture community. We're all the better for having them here. They're the folks who agree with that statement. You want to ask questions like, to what extent do you agree, disagree? Talking about race is essential and moves our country forward. You want to ask questions about the role of government and the importance of unions, the importance of racial justice and immigrant rights, gender equality. And then we define our base as our choir, the people who agree with us across the board on these values and on these policy positions. And our job with that base, what we're measuring for, is how do we move that group of people from agreement, where they begin, right? We define our base as the people who agree with us, which means that every message we test on our base likes the message. That's just tautological. That's how we define them. So that's not an achievement. What we're measuring with the base is propensity to repeat. So not just do they agree with this, but are they going to say it themselves? Because we believe that if your words don't spread, they don't work. And if your choir doesn't want to sing from the songbook, then the congregation is not going to get the joyful noise and they're not going to go convert new adherents, right? So that's the theory of change. Then we define a group of people who are our opposition. And this is really, really a vital distinction. The opposition in the kind of testing that I'm used to is not just the Republicans in the sample. We'll just stick all of them in there. Again, it's defined attitudinally. So they're the people who get all the questions wrong, all of them. They are, generally speaking, in a representative US sample around most of the kind of testing that I've done, between 15 and 22% of the sample, right? Whereas Republicans in the sample, a nationally representative sample, would be 40% Republicans. That's sort of how that breaks out. So,
that's a really important point I want to hang on for a second, because in the usual discourse around, what's persuasive and what our politics looks like, we're used to phrases like half the country is, with Trump, or half the country is not on board with Trump. But at this level of detail, the people who are really politicized in one direction or the other, it's quite smaller.
Oh, it's tiny. And yeah, there's no such thing as half the people. Like that's, half the people are not Beyonce. Like even Beyonce doesn't take the general public as her audience. That's just, and if Beyonce can't pull the general public as her audience, then none of us can. The end.
Yeah, exactly.
So that 15 to 20% of people, depending on what we're measuring and what the test is and what the issue is, those are the people we need to understand we cannot, shall not, will never have. You will never, ever have them. They don't like you. You lost them at hello to offer, to bend a canard. And what we're looking for with those people is we want them to dislike what we're saying. We want to see them in terms of online dial testing, where people have a little dial and they dial up when they feel warmly in agreement and they dial down when they don't like it. We want to see them dialing down. And the reason for that is that if those people like what you're saying, what are you saying? You're either saying, I believe that children are our future. You're saying nothing, right? You're not advancing a political argument. You're saying something that everybody's fine with, but you're not actually moving people towards your policy position. Or you are inadvertently reinforcing an argument that actually is for your opposition, and thereby confusing the persuadables, which make up the bulk of our populations. It's generally around 60%. So first of all, we're looking for messages that engage our base, and we are looking to see that those messages are touching a nerve, right? If you want to touch a nerve, you've got to touch a nerve. And then, vitally, we are measuring, do those messages persuade that bulk of people in the middle? And again, by the middle, I want to underscore, I don't mean partisan swing voters. That is a much, much, much smaller number. That is not 60% of voters by any stretch of the imagination, because partisan identity is a really big deal. I am talking about ideologically persuadable people who agree with us that immigrants contribute to our culture and community, and agree with the other side that we should be deporting people and immigrants take our jobs. People who agree with us that talking about race is essential to move the country forward, and agree that talking about race is divisive and moves our country backwards. I call them the good point people, because they're like this. Good point, but yeah, good point, but also good point.
Yeah, it's such an interesting audience, and I feel like I've done a lot of canvassing and field organizing too. So I feel like I've gotten to talk to a lot of these voters in person when they decide to engage with me when I'm clipboarding, or if I'm trying to do some persuasion stuff out in public, and not just trying to get partisan Democrats to remember to vote in and off your election. And I think this is a really important distinction, because sometimes, these folks are referred to as being cross-pressured. But in my mind, it's more like they're just not highly politicized on these issues. They don't have some firm sense of, I'm a liberal, I'm supposed to believe X because that's what all the liberals say. I'm a conservative, I'm supposed to believe Y because that's what all the conservatives say. They can really go either direction depending on what information and what messages you expose them to and from whom.
And one of the most interesting things about them is that they are especially prone to what we call anchoring effects. That is, changing their mind or altering their perceptions based on information that has just been given to them, even information that is basically irrelevant to the situation. So these are the folks who really, they toggle between competing understandings of, quote unquote, the way the world works. And what they hear repeated most frequently is what is true about the world. There's no other way to explain the rapidity of the change in terms of perception of an issue. Take, for example, like marriage equality. How could we possibly explain the rapidity of, the 180-degree shift in a very, very short time in terms of you're thinking about kind of cultural norms and cultural assumptions? Once it became the dominant idea and the dominant trope and the dominant sort of common sense view among the base, and the base was energized to repeat, love is love makes a family, love is love makes a family, then that became what was activated and true in the middle. Did it all of a sudden, did their upbringing for some of them as evangelical Christians or as Catholics, did all of that programming go away? No, of course it didn't. That was still latent in them. But what happened was the base, through this repetition of these values-based arguments, was able to sort of bring their higher angels, their kind of inherent progressivism to the fore. And that is actually the way that shift works. You talked earlier about kind of the limitations and the attachment to this rational actor model. I think one of the most useful ways to kind of take apart or think about the limitations and the unhelpfulness of that rational actor model in terms of how the median voter makes a decision is the idea that decision-making occurs at an individual level. It just doesn't. It just does not. People, and this has been proven over and over and over again through a series of studies, people make decisions based upon the cues that they are given about a topic. that those cues can be sort of, who is the messenger? What do people who look like me think about it? What have people that I trusted said about it before? We are incapable. We are a social species. We come to decisions in a social context. And so whatever is kind of the prevailing ethos about a certain concept or notion radically informs what we feel to be our rational individual opinion that we came to because we were really smart and by ourselves we thought through the arguments, and that's why we hold this position. That's what we want to think about ourselves. That is not how we work.
Yeah. So much of it is post hoc. You're also making me think of like this absolute cursed canvassing visit that I'll never forget, which was knocking on someone's door. They answered. I started talking with them about the election. This was in 2016, and one of their roommates, saw that we were having a political conversation and just announced very loudly that there was no way she was voting for Clinton and there was no way she was voting for Trump, and they were both disgusting, and really went off. But I'm not a good enough canvasser to have saved that situation. I was like, okay, I just got to write off this whole conversation now. Like, she was running so hot. And it was just the opposite of what you want to have, right? Because that entire household was now infected with somebody who was like, okay, the good, noble, rational position is to believe the worst thing that each side of this campaign is trying to tell me. So now I'm going to be an active demobilizer of my roommates. And I was like, okay, I just have to move on. This person's not going to update their voter registration with me. This is too negative. But that can work too. And I often think, like, from her perspective, that was actually, and you hear this a lot from voters, that is a socially rational thing to believe, because now you're not taking sides, right? Now like, no one can accuse you of being on one side or the other, because now you've adopted this decision to opt out, and people can be persuaded to opt out too. And that is also part of campaigns and is also strategic.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think that, some of that is, as you described, this canvassing experience, and I wouldn't fault you for your canvassing chops. I think that you've described a perfect example of a situation that
was hard mode.
That video game, that leveled up past where I really think anybody, because in that situation, that roommate is a trusted messenger. They're a known entity and you're a stranger. And there's no way for a stranger to kind of outdo what a relationship, what messaging that is delivered within the context of relationship can do. And in fact, ironically, to come back to a point that I made earlier, it's why we have such an emphasis on messages that engage the base, because what we know is that the persuasive power of anything that comes via a stranger, whether that be a person at a door, which is, a good and useful in pre-COVID life when we could still do that, a person on a phone, the persuasive power of that, and even less so digital ads, which, I say this as somebody who makes digital ads. So yeah, I make them. I think that they have their role. But the fact is that it is always going to be more motivating, mobilizing, and persuasive what you hear from your friend, from your cousin, from a person that you like and trust, and what is being repeated over and over and over in your social circles is always going to carry more weight than something that is delivered to you through broadcast communication, or even through the higher touch kind of canvas thing, because that person is still a stranger and therefore a suspect messenger.
And I just had one more question for you, which was about effect size in your research. And, I wanted to get into this because we often, especially like the cable news talking head kind of universe, right? Like it's so easy to have this reductive debate about what the right or wrong message is. And in the reality of our work, there's just messages with varying levels of efficacy. And to your point, there's messages that have varying levels of like actual connection to progressive policies that we like. So how do you think about effect size, and how does this show up in your research for a less good message versus a better message, and that kind of spectrum thinking we do?
So everyone tells us they're definitely going to vote. Yes, that message makes me want to vote more. Absolutely, I'm voting, right? It's like going to the gym and eating vegetables. Everybody's doing it. 100% of people are doing that tomorrow. Absolutely. Definitely. But in fact, not at all. So with questions, when we're trying to measure effect size on behaviors like voting, what we do, if we're doing it well, is we don't measure self-reporting. We don't ask people, does this make you want to vote? Because their answer is a lie. And it's not even because they're liars. We only know what we think that we think, right? They think their conscious feeling about it is, yes, this feels motivating to me. But when push comes to shove and the day comes and it's hectic and it's busy, and let's not discount the role of voter suppression and the intentional difficulty that is manufactured to keep Black and brown and other people of color from voting, right? That's all on purpose, that voting is incredibly hard, especially for certain groups of people. Something's going to come up and they're not necessarily going to take that action that day. So with respect to voting, we measure effect sizes by doing in-field experiments where we are actually measuring in a randomized controlled trial. I sent 1,000 people this mailer, I sent 1,000 people that mailer, I sent 1,000 people a placebo that wasn't about voting at all. And then after the fact, I actually measure who registered, or I measure who turned out. So that's one thing that we do that is obviously far, far more reliable, is to do in-field experiments. And there's other kind of in-field experiments you can do around issues. David Brockman and Josh Kalla just did, for example, a huge measure, and they're doing another with a people's action deep canvas. And we're actually measuring attitude shift both in the moment at the door, but then also they're able to measure, I should say, the half-life of that effect. So 6 weeks later, do they still feel that way when they're being asked again? Another way that we can do it, sorry, is this way more detail than you wanted?
No, this is the real stuff. I want people to understand the mechanics of like actual persuasion beyond the op-ed column.
Right.
This is what it really looks like on the ground.
Now a Ken Burns thing that nobody is getting all the way
through.
This
is more of an American experience vibe, like the actual process of doing this stuff is really
everyone
important.
Likes sausage making. It's so fun.
Well, we don't get to do the randomized controlled experiments when we have to make a decision a week from now in a live campaign environment, right? Some of these learnings happen over time. A lot of them are based on shorter term research and things, to use your term, that we have to do with a captive audience.
Yeah. So, then there's other kinds of in-field testing where, the gold standard, what we try to do, what we should be doing, is not measuring self-reporting. We should be measuring things like, did it actually make you click on the link? Did it actually make you complete the registration? Did it actually, when we're trying to look at attitudes, right? So let's say we're trying to move people on fair housing, or we're trying to move people on a giant measure to provide services to people who've been made homeless. What we would want to measure is more concrete things like, did it make you want to share the thing? Did it make you want to sign the petition? Did it make you alter your vote choice, rather than just, did you like what I said to you? So we can do things like that, right? We can put more concrete parameters so that we can measure not just self-reporting, but action. And then we can do in-field testing, like some of what I've described, or, you can serve people an ad through YouTube pre-roll and then give them a survey a month later or a week later that is about that topic. And so they're no longer attaching the act of having watched that ad to being asked about that ad. They don't remember. And you can see whether there's any kind of measurable change. When we do in-field stuff like that, not captive audience, the effect sizes are always smaller. I don't think that that's a shock. But, and here's what I mean by controlling for the difference and why I still do use captive audience testing of very many kinds. The theory of change is that repetition is absolutely essential. It cannot be repeated enough. If we're going to be cheesy and say, we cannot repeat enough how important it is to repeat. Because a message that is repeated over and over and over again, a message that feels familiar to people, creates what we call cognitive ease. People can kind of fill in the answer, and they don't have to do any kind of mental strain. They know what it's going to say. A message that is familiar to people is rated as being more true and more credible. It's rated as being more desirable without regard to the content of that message. Just familiarity, and familiarity bias is real. So my argument is that captive audience testing of various kinds, which is most of the kind of testing that happens, even if it's showing us effect sizes that are not real, right? It's showing us effect sizes that are larger than what that piece of content, that ad, that script actually would produce in the wild. It's still giving us a relative measure of, does the A script do better than the B script, do better than the C script? And if we're learning that the A script does better, even if the effect size that we're seeing and measuring is probably bigger than what it would truly be, then what that tells us is that's where we should put our eggs in that basket. That's where we need to be repeating. That's the message we need to be amplifying. That's the discourse that we need to be bringing to the fore over and over and over again, so that in the wild, where it's really hard to break a signal through the noise, where you don't have a captive audience, where you have lots of competing signals, where people are not paying any attention to what you're saying, you have a prayer of breaking through. And, so yeah, it's probably overestimating effect sizes, almost surely, but what it's telling us is, what do we need to do? What are the things that we need to focus in on and repeat? And what are the things that are not going to work for us? Does that make sense?
It absolutely makes sense. And I really appreciate you taking the time, because this is such a nuanced, precise view of how we think about this stuff as advocates and as campaigners. And I wish that this view was more represented in the political press, because I think it makes people savvier activists and savvier volunteers too, whether they're starting up their own local organizations, knocking on doors, et cetera. And I know you're pressed on time here. Was there anything else that you wanted to add before we left it off?
Yeah, I want to say one more thing. I consider myself to be a pathological optimist, so I feel it's incumbent upon me to inject some sort of hope or something. Although I wouldn't argue that I've been especially cynical in this particular interview. I definitely get more cynical in other spaces. I've just been much more technical. What I want to say is that another thing that we are finding, and is true, and this is really the insight and work of a whole host of really brilliant researchers. I can't take credit for this myself, but persuasion windows are real.
Yep.
And there are moments where, especially when there is a new concept or idea or some kind of rupture in the public, where people are really softened up to a new mode of thinking. So we saw, for example, mid-end of March, that when folks were doing testing around COVID content, huge effect sizes, just, sort of mind-boggling how large an ad was registering in terms of altering people's perceptions of Trump, altering people's desire for government spending, for revenue, for taxation, all the kinds of things that we would want to be seeing. That same piece of content, that exact same ad with no alteration, shown to people in April, was not having that effect. The same thing is true for the protest moment. There are moments of rupture which are born of the tireless, incredible, steadfast work of organizing, almost always led by Black women, Black people, other people of color. That is what creates the conditions. That is what creates the openings for a piece of persuasion to actually have a shot. And so there are moments where we can get far, far greater persuasive power around a concept than in other moments when people's conception kind of seals off. They go to their partisan corners and they already are like, oh, well, this is what my kind of a person thinks about this topic. And that piece of stimuli, that ad, that script, that whatever it is no longer as effective, even though you've done nothing to it.
That's really important to bear in mind, because movements create so much more space for the tactical stuff that we're often doing day to day. And that's what democracy looks like, right? Those openings and those rupture moments are how change happens. And I can't help but think about John Lewis and the messages that he left us with today, and we really got to take inspiration from that. It's easy to kind of get lost in the technicalities here, but the mechanics of persuasion are directly downstream of movement politics and of democracy. So I think that's a great note to end on, and I really appreciate you taking the time. That was such a detailed conversation, and I do a lot of work like this, so I'm conversant in the sort of stuff that Anat does, but to hear her explain it and to hear her pick apart some of these simplistic narratives we have about persuasion and compare them to her actual work and the things that she sees in focus groups and dial tests and polling, it's fascinating. I find this work to be so rich and so valuable, and the sort of work that researchers do, that political communicators do, it can really move the ball forward on policy. It can really help movements, advocacy groups, campaigns, not just eke out narrow victories in this upcoming election, right? But to make big victories that actually change our politics for the better. And that's what we're after here. And especially for progressive campaigns, for people who are doing progressive activism, you're often fighting uphill on the resource front. And the most valuable resource you have isn't the multi-million-dollar ad budget. The most valuable resource you have is people who are with you on the issues. And I hope you found what Anat had to say about the choir persuasive, right? The choir's with us. Can we give the choir better messages that get more people to join the choir, that bring more people who are persuadable over to our side on those issues? And again, I'll just emphasize one last time, please do check out the Race Class Narrative if you haven't seen it yet. I will put that in the show notes. It's some of the best political communication research I've ever seen, and it so directly addresses tons of different pressing issues that are intersecting right now. It's a very powerful communications framework. I've used it when I've gone door knocking. I've used it writing press releases, op-eds, doing strategic communication platforms for organizations. I've used it on the Hill. It's really, really valuable stuff, and it's out there for free. It's a public service for everybody who does work in advocacy, in movements, and in and around progressive politics. So stay safe out there, and don't be afraid to go and persuade some people that you're actually right about politics. It can happen. It does happen. It's true. Take it easy.